We're going to get right into it. So we are honored here today to have Dr. Rachel Fish, the founding executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism, here to speak with us today. So the foundation that I just mentioned focuses on positively impacting attitudes of young people around the world and leveraging social media to deliver educational campaigns and spur action by people of all backgrounds. Dr. Fish was most recently the senior advisor and resident scholar of Jewish Israel philanthropy at the Paul E. Singer Foundation. She worked closely with grantees to support them and provided framing around their educational content and programming. Dr. Fish was also the executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, where she helped train the next generation of academics in the field of Israel studies. She also received her PhD in the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University. Dr. Fish, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Zach, and thank you for Gen Z for providing this platform for teenagers and parents to really explore complex issues and think carefully together about how to engage in difficult conversations. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we do, and then we'll open it up to a conversation. So I work for the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism, which is an organization that the Kraft family began. And the purpose of the organization really is to think about how to create a conversation in which anti-Semitism relates to other forms of hatred. And we have done this by developing, through a public initiative, a movement called TBH, Together Beat Hate. And all of you who have your phones out, go to Instagram and follow Together Beat Hate, because you will see on our social platforms of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that we're putting anti-Semitism not in a separate category, but putting anti-Semitism in conversation with racism, homophobia, misogyny, Islamophobia, xenophobia, for the purpose of recognizing that even though each of these forms of hatred have unique characteristics, which they do, and have a unique context in which they each have emerged, they also have shared underlying foundations. And we believe through our work that anti-Semitism has too often been siloed from those conversations and made to be only a Jewish issue, when actually we know that when we begin to see anti-Semitism within our societies, it begins to be the fraying of democracy. So we're trying to create a way for individuals to recognize that all these forms of hatred actually need to be in conversation with one another. And when we talk about anti-Semitism, I just want to say very clearly that we're talking about anti-Semitism in all of its manifestations. So what I mean by that is whether it is Judeophobia, hatred of the Jews because of their religious identity, Jewishness, or if it's because of hatred of the Jews because of their supposed racial, ethnic composition, like we saw during the period of the 19th and 20th century, like the Holocaust, or whether it's because Jews have their own nation state, Israel, and have a collective desire for self-determination, a form of nationalism. All of these forms, we believe, are forms of anti-Semitism. And we can see that those forms of anti-Semitism can exist on the political right with white supremacists. We can see that it exists on the political left, those who deny Jews the right and existence of the state of Israel, or suggest that Jews are only a white privileged people, which is problematic. Or if it's from radical Islamism, which doesn't like the idea of Jews having an ability for self-determination and control over one's own political agency in the region of the Middle East, which used to be also under Islamic control. It's a radical form of political, theological expressions of Islam. So all of these forms of anti-Semitism, we are trying to combat and educate around and create greater sensitivity for Jews and non-Jews to understand what this issue is and why it needs to be socially unacceptable in the 21st century.
That's really just incredible what you guys do there, and how you really just do your all to fight all different forms of hate. So we're going to start this off with a fairly difficult question, but what do you think is the best way to fight anti-Semitism?
So it totally depends how the anti-Semitism presents itself. It also depends on the context in which it emerges. If we're talking about social media, if we're talking about in the classroom, if we're talking about a joke that a friend makes that they think may be funny, but actually is playing off of stereotypical tropes of anti-Semitism. And we have to think, what is the purpose when we are going to speak in order to say something? Are we trying to educate the person? Is the person already a detractor and we know that they're not going to actually change their heart or their mind? But are there other people around them that we want to influence who may not know anything about this subject? Is it that we recognize that people are using a platform, whether it's media or their status, in order to project a particular identity about Jews to a broader audience that may know nothing? Each of these scenarios, you would respond differently. And so I would say the first thing to do is, in order to be able to even feel comfortable to respond, all of the people what we're talking to tonight need to be educated about the subject so that they feel they have the confidence and they understand the subject matter in order to be able to speak about it. Secondly, we really do have to decide, are we trying to use this moment as a growth opportunity, a learning opportunity? Because it's okay if someone makes a mistake and says something that is not acceptable to a particular community, but they learn from it. That's how we learn. So we want to find ways to bring people into the conversation so we can sensitize them so they don't make that mistake again, because we all mess up at times. So we need education all the time. It's also okay if someone says something and they didn't recognize, and it comes from a place of really, truly not knowing, and we have an opportunity to teach them. What's not okay is if someone is actually inciting hatred, promoting violence, or encouraging others to do so. And in that case, we have to take the response very seriously in what we do and make sure that we tell the appropriate individuals, whether it's grown-ups, educators, whether it's police, other organizations that track this information like the Anti-Defamation League, even the FBI, because hate crimes need to be reported so that they can be counted and assessed and analyzed. So it really depends on the situation. But I would say that the first step is that everyone needs to be educated themselves in order to be able to feel like they have the ability to speak up.
And as you were talking about earlier, as Together Beat Hate really includes anti-Semitism in the conversation of hatred and how we can fight hatred in general, why do you think anti-Semitism is sometimes not in that conversation as much as like other forms of hate?
It's a really good question, Zach. And it has a complicated history in that regard. If you look at the historical transformation of Jew hatred over time, there have been a variety of ways in which Jew hatred was not considered to be like these other forms of hatred, because Jews often are seen as being elite. They're seen as being part of the upper middle class. They're seen as having the ability to navigate a variety of political and professional disciplines. And very often there is a sense, because anti-Semitism really is a conspiracy theory, that most of the time hatred is about punching down, right? It's about taking someone who you think is less than you and you're not really threatened by them and pushing them down even more. So what does it look like when a form of hatred not only wants to push down, but also punches up? And punches up because Jews are seen as threatening someone else's ability to have upward social mobility or have access to those political professional fields. And that kind of hatred is unique very often. And because of that, many people don't understand that it is still a form of hatred. This is what a conspiracy theory does. A conspiracy theory finds a way to transform in order to find the scapegoat within a society that is not always the most obvious, but if you can get enough people to understand that that's the scapegoat, then ultimately you are able to repeat that message over and over again for the purpose of perpetuating a lie, the stereotype, and ultimately getting other people to start to say, oh yeah, that particular people is problematic, or oh yeah, I know one of those people and here's how I see them. And it becomes the obsessive focus. So anti-Semitism over time has done just that, meaning for a long time, especially during the early stages of Christianity and during the medieval period, Jews were seen as being different because of their religious identity. And so they were scapegoated because of that and blamed for a variety of issues like the bubonic plague, right? Things that Jews had no control over themselves, but ultimately were blamed for. At the same time, you also had other groups that were also part of communities that weren't Christian, but they weren't considered to be a threat. So they're not going to be scapegoated. So you identify the one entity that you're most concerned about. Think about during the period of the 19th century and the 20th century, when Jews are then hated because of their supposed racial composition. So some of you may be studying the Holocaust, for example. And you know that when you're studying about the Holocaust and learning about what was happening during the rise of Nazism in Germany and then throughout parts of Europe, that Hitler and the Nazis perpetuated a lie, right? The lie was that Jews don't have the same DNA as we Aryans have. And DNA is immutable. You can't change your DNA. So even if these Jews, some of them were to convert from Judaism to Christianity, they're still problematic because they're still Jews in their ethnic DNA and their composition of who they are. So therefore, they can never really change. And remember, this is the time in which you had this pseudoscience, a fake science called eugenics, that was really trying to create a sense of racial science. Well, ultimately, that was just to prove in quotes, that people weren't just purely Aryan. And Jews then get blamed because they're seen as being individuals who are causing a deterioration of culture, of society. So you blame them. So this is what happens with Israel today on the world stage. If someone thinks that Israel is the worst human rights violator out of all the countries in the world and is obsessed with Israel and demonizes, dehumanizes, holds Israel to a double standard or incites violence against Israel or Israelis, that is another form of anti-Semitism. And again, it's about scapegoating and not focusing on the societal challenges within their own countries, within their own communities, but looking to blame someone else. So that's the purpose of anti-Semitism. That's very complicated and challenging for many people to understand. And it is often seen as just being a Jewish problem. But we know that homophobia is not just a problem for the LGBTQ plus community, right? We know that racism is not just a problem for the Black community, the African American community, or people of color. So why should anti-Semitism just be a Jewish problem? And the answer is it shouldn't. So we have to find ways to build bridges between communities in order to create greater understanding and really humanize one another and recognize that we all come from different backgrounds. We should celebrate our differences and our diversity, and then also look to learn about each other's complex identities, and we have multiple identities. So that requires the building of the muscle of compassion and empathy. And you know what, Zach? That's really hard for some people to do.
And as you were talking about just so many times Jews have been scapegoats for things, how do you think, at least in these past 14 months, how do you think with like COVID starting and to now, how do you think Jews have become more of scapegoats, or hopefully less, but yeah.
Well, I think it's a variety of things. Let's look at New York, for example. New York City, Brooklyn. We've seen that during this period of COVID, there have been increased attacks against identifiably Jewish people, right? Especially in Brooklyn, people who are from the ultra-Orthodox community in particular. And usually when you start to see that kind of hatred, it's out of a place of fear. People are responding to fear because they've created the framework of us against them. And people are looking to figure out who's the them. And it doesn't take much to identify Jews as the them. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that we are living in a politically divisive period. And it doesn't matter if you are progressive, if you're a Democrat, if you're a centrist, if you're a conservative, it really doesn't matter. If you're seeking ultimately to put blame on a particular group of people, then whether you're from the political right or the political left, Jews tend to be the scapegoat that are chosen. So here's an example during the COVID period. We have had political individuals who have blamed Jews for spreading COVID. We've had elected officials who have talked about Israel in a very negative way because of the perception that Israel was only taking care of Jews instead of all of its citizens, which it has done. But that's that kind of obsessiveness that leads to ultimately trying to create that us against them mentality, which ultimately leads to confrontation. So COVID actually brought out some of the worst in people politically. Also, because of conspiracy theories like QAnon, utilized COVID to play up the fears of people again, and then also connected it with political ideologies in which Jews were perceived in certain ways. Even if they didn't say the term Jews, it was the typical anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes that we know have historically existed that point directly to the Jewish community. But if you're not sensitive to understanding the nuance of all of this, not everyone recognizes what is happening, but unfortunately, it starts to create a fertile ground for this kind of anti-Semitic behavior to bubble up and to start to emerge and then present itself. And this is what we have to be vigilant against.
And just taking a question from the Q&A here, and remember, keep putting questions in there. We love to read them and answer them. Do you think that there is a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
So it's a great question. And because I'm trained as a historian, I would actually step back and put it in a historical context. So Zionism emerges in the 19th century. And remember, Zionism is a response to what's happening in Europe and the Jewish question that Jews are struggling with in a European setting. It's also the time in which you have an emergence of a variety of nationalisms sweeping across Europe. So it's part of that larger conversation. Jews are asking themselves, do we assimilate into the host societies in which we are living so that we can try to be fully accepted as citizens? Or do we try to figure out what to do about the issues of anti-Semitism, because we are being persecuted from pogroms, from mobs and riots, and even from government decisions and and military decisions by the leadership of some of these empires in the 19th century. And one of the responses to the Jewish predicament in Europe was Zionism. And it was a variety of ideas of Zionisms. There were responses that were cultural, there were responses that were religious Zionism, spiritual Zionism, and political Zionism. And sometimes that political Zionism took the form of socialist Zionism, and sometimes it took the form of capitalist Zionism. So you can imagine that there's a lot of discussion about all of these ways Jews can think about Zionism. And this is, again, like 1897, right? 1880s. Another legitimate form that presented itself was an anti-Zionist position. That anti-Zionist position said, I don't think the idea of Jews desiring to be part of a national movement that they control is the right answer. And they had different forms of political representation that they suggested as an option. That's in that 19th century period. Anti-Zionism was an acceptable form of a position along that spectrum of ideas within the Jewish community. Some agreed, some didn't agree. There were some who said Jews should not all live in one place and control their own destiny, but rather they should try to live in all these other societies and create autonomous communities that they have some say over within these empires or nation states that are emerging. So what happens? Because I'm saying it's legitimate to say that anti-Zionism is acceptable. Well, what happens is that once you have the creation of the state in 1948 and Israel now exists, the idea of anti-Zionism takes on a different context. Anti-Zionism after that says Jews don't have the right to political self-determination. Now, Zach, if someone tells me that no people has a right to political self-determination and they're against all forms of nationalism, that's an acceptable position. I may not agree with it, but that's an acceptable position. But if it's only Jews as a collective people who don't have a right to self-determination, to me, that's a double standard. And so I would say if that happens, then that's a form of anti-Semitism. Now, I also want to say very clearly, anyone and everyone can critique Israeli policy. Israelis critique Israeli policy, whether you are a secular Tel Avivian who doesn't want anything to do with the current Israeli administration and with the Likud party, or if you're a settler who lives in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank and doesn't want anything to do with a secular state. And Jews and non-Jews all have the ability to criticize Israel. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the starting point being, does Israel have a right to exist? And if the answer to that is yes, Israel doesn't have a right to exist, then I think we have a problem, because no one says America doesn't have a right to exist in spite of all the challenges America has. So that's why I would say anti-Zionism, the way it is presented today, is often used as a political guise in order to be able to hide one's actual anti-Semitism. But you have to put it in a context, and you have to have a conversation with somebody to really understand how they're using the term.
So I've seen in some articles that have been written by some really famous people or really outspoken people on the topics of anti-Semitism, they've used the terms scientific racism. Could you explain what that means and how it can be very damaging?
Yeah, I mean, without knowing exactly what you read, I'm assuming that they're talking and referring to ideas from a practice of eugenics. I'm assuming, but I don't know without knowing what you read. You can tell me if it was a different context than that.
I believe it was eugenics.
Yeah. So again, this goes back to the period in the late 19th, early 20th century, when there's a sense that the Aryan identity was a pure German identity. And that pure German identity was supposedly based upon DNA. And that DNA was more superior than someone who had DNA from another place. And there was no way the person who came from another origin could at all be equal to the individual who is purely Aryan. Jews in Germany and in other parts of Europe were often referred to as the Easterners, the Semites, the Orientals. Why? Because where's the Semitic territory? The Semitic region is that Mediterranean region, the Levant. Now, the idea, the category even of Semitic is actually a geographical and a linguistic category, meaning the languages of Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, they all have the same linguistic dialectical roots, shorashim, right? It's like why shalom and salam sound so similar, right? Even some of the letters look very similar. But the term Semitic wasn't actually used to talk about peoples from those territories. That happens later. And then when it happens, it's used to say, you Semites, you're not purely Aryan. You come from the East. You're different than us in terms of your DNA. And because you're different, your DNA is less than. And that is part of the conversation of this false, science that is a pseudoscience, which I actually will say is why there are many people who don't even understand what the term anti-Semitism means. So what do I mean by that? I'll often hear people say, if I say, what is anti-Semitism? They'll say, well, I'm anti-racist. I'm anti-homophobic. I'm anti-Islamophobia. And if you say, and what about anti-Semitism? They'll say, well, I'm probably an anti-Semite. Because they think if you put anti in front of it, then it makes them okay. And what we have to say is actually you want to be an anti-Semite. So they don't even understand the word because it has this pseudo-scientific word. So the question then becomes, so what should we call it? And I would say we should call it Jew hatred. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable with that because it's very clear, it's very direct. And some people would even say it's a little crass. But I would say, well, guess what? Jew hatred is crass. It's ugly. And the more we can directly articulate how ugly it is by being very clear with our language, I think it will actually help educate people.
And another question from the audience. On the topic of scapegoating, how would you explain the opposing belief of the Jewish capitalist and then the Jewish communist, who were both seen as anti-Semitic stereotypes at the exact same time in history?
Well, that's exactly the point of it being a conspiracy theory. That's exactly the point. Because from the right, you're going to be accused of being communist. And from the left, you're going to be accused of being capitalist. And either way, you're punching up in order to bring down that particular group. Jews can be the evil ones over here, conspiring, having all these ideas about how to make money and then how to hoard that money. That's a stereotype. Or Jews are about giving everything away to everyone and creating a society that's purely based on the ideas of communism, which ultimately could hurt individual desires. So this is part of the challenge, is that these are complex ideas. These are complex ideologies. And because it continues to morph, that's part of the conspiracy piece. And this is why Jews also are caught in the crosshairs, because by some, if you want to talk about money, it's about socialism and it's about capitalism. If you want to talk about the whole discourse around how Jews are white, well, white supremacists do not think that Jews are white. They're the other. But if you're far left, then Jews are considered to be white and privileged. And their Jewishness is sublimated, and the Jewish experience is sublimated, and anti-Semitism is not part of the conversation. So this is absolutely the challenge, and why it is so difficult for individuals who are not familiar with it to understand and label it, identify it, and then talk about it.
And earlier, like in answering this question, you said that these really are just conspiracy theories. So why do you think that Jews take the brunt force of all of these different scapegoats and conspiracy theories throughout history?
Listen, we are a people that has remained, right? Meaning for millennia, Jews have survived. And not only have Jews survived, Jews have had incredible contributions to society, any society in which Jews have lived. Remember, where does the Holocaust begin? It begins in Germany. Jews were very acculturated in Germany. They were part of the elite upper class. They were contributing in terms of building culture. They were writers, they were poets, they were musicians, they were composers. Jews were going to schools and getting professional degrees. They were influencing at multiple levels of society, and they're succeeding. So it's not as if the Holocaust began in a place in which Jews were living as peasants and not contributing, but rather the Holocaust begins in a place in which this is one of the most assimilated, acculturated, and most well-educated communities of Europe. And it still happens. And that's where it begins. So because of this millennia-old hatred toward the Jews, and the Jews' tenacity to persist, and not only persist, but to be valuable contributors to the societies in which they are living, for some, that is a real thorn in the side. And no matter what society Jews live in, it doesn't take much to find anti-Semitism. I truly believe anti-Semitism will never go away. I really don't. It doesn't mean that we can't educate about it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't learn about it. But to think that we're going to eradicate it, I think actually isn't realistic and might be a little irrational. So the question for me is, so how do we create greater understanding? And when we're living, especially in America, in a society that is going through a conversation about trying to create greater sensitivity to all other peoples, how do we ensure that Jews are also part of that conversation?
So my group, Gen Z, tries to educate my generation. And so what actions do you think Gen Z can do as individuals, or not even just Gen Z, just everyone in general? What actions can people take other than following Together Beat Hate and Gen Z Jews on Instagram? Like, what actions can we take to get more involved in this fight?
So I think there are lots of things you can do. First of all, I would say read. And when you read beyond the headline and read multiple sources and read the primary sources, right? You should actually know who Wilhelm Marr is, who coins the term anti-Semitism. You should actually start to understand why Jews were hated in that medieval period, which is very different than why Jews may be hated today. That stuff matters. So that's one. Read books written by professors and by teachers, and then read literature. Read the experiences of individuals who have lived in different societies and have had to navigate their Jewish identity, whether it was in Iraq, whether it was in Egypt, whether it was in Poland or America, because those experiences will help you understand the Jewish historical experience over time. And that's very important. The other thing I would say is that when you do encounter anti-Semitism, think about the ways in which you can have the best impact to stand up against it. So if it's in your school newspaper, and a lot of people read your newspaper, what is the letter that you need to write? Who is the editor with whom you need to have a conversation? If you encounter someone saying something, and maybe they're even your friend, but they make a stereotypical derogatory remark about Jews, how do you model having that conversation where you don't make them feel like the worst person in the world, but use it as a teaching opportunity? At the same time, when you also encounter anti-Semitism online, what do? What if it came from your friend who said it? Which is different than if it's just some other conversation in a thread. When do you actually respond? When do you not respond because you're bringing too much attention to it? So you have to weigh some of these things. The other pieces I would say is that there are lots of important organizations to get involved with. And those are Facing History and Ourselves. That is the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee. They have high school initiatives. There are all of those do. There are initiatives with Stand With Us. There's initiatives with combatantisemitism.org, all different organizations. So how can you each get involved? The other thing I would say is have conversations with your friends. You all, as Gen Zers, are very socially engaged in discussions. And I would say, try to make sure that you talk about the things that matter to you. And if anti-Semitism is a concern, talk about it. You know, if you find that your friends are willing to talk about all other forms of hatred, but not anti-Semitism, nicely ask them, why not? Do they not understand it? Do they not see it as a problem? Do they understand how it presents itself today, whether it's, a Holocaust memorial being defaced, or a Holocaust denier being given a platform, or even, a certain political statement that's made wherever it is? The other thing I would say is that when it comes to anti-Semitism, because it can be so politicized, it's really important to call it out wherever it exists. Because when you don't, that's actually when you start to politicize it. So if you are a certain political position and you hear and see anti-Semitism coming from that position, it's really important, all the more so that you call it out, and not just when it's across the aisle. So I would say there are lots of opportunities. You all also have the power of social media. You can talk about it on those platforms. You can write blogs. You can create incredible creative content with videos and animation so that you can find ways to reach your peers and educate them in a way that will resonate the way you all like to communicate.
So, although my organization is for all of Gen Z and especially Gen Z Jews, and we try to be nonpartisan, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene explaining that the Californian wildfires are a result of Jewish space lasers. Do you think that other members of Congress who don't disavow her statements are almost complicit with QAnon and only leading to more anti-Semitism?
So I'm not sure that they're complicit with QAnon, but I do think, whether it's right of center or left of center, that if you aren't willing to call out or call in to a serious conversation for the purpose of correcting inaccuracies and lies and distortions, then we have a problem. And it is the absolute responsibility of those in that political party to denounce those statements and help educate her so she is more informed about the issues. That's how I would approach it. And I think that that actually really matters.
And do you think that that goes for the same to Congresswoman Mary Miller, who said that Hitler was right about one thing on January 6th?
And it's the reason I also say, if Rashida Tlaib says from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, she ought to know that when you say that, you're actually calling for the destruction of the only Jewish state in the world, in the global community. So for me, it's fair game, whether you're left or right politically, because if you allow these statements to go without any response, you ultimately are creating that fertile ground for that anti-Semitism to bubble up.
And why do you think there are people who just say that it's all this anti-Semitism is only on one side of the political spectrum and don't call out people like Rashida Tlaib?
I think, Zach, that we live in a very divisive political country right now. And people really are strident about their political positions, and they will make excuses for individuals within their political camps because they desire to prioritize other things that they have said and sort of ignore others and allow it to slide by. And I think that anytime we as Jews do that, we actually harm our position because we politicize the issue of anti-Semitism. And think about replacing the term Jews, right, when that's made, or Israel when that's made, with any other group. And I think what we would find is we would feel really uncomfortable if we were talking about other minority communities or other marginalized populations. And we would probably say, well, that's not okay. That doesn't feel right. So why do we not do it when it's about Jews? And I would say it's a really easy way to create the test to say, well, if I wouldn't feel okay if they said that about one of the other marginalized populations, then I shouldn't feel okay about them saying it about Jews.
And how do you think maybe college students should react when one of their friends does something like support BDS or does just blatant anti-Semitism on their college campuses? How should someone who maybe has never experienced that level of anti-Semitism before approach that?
So, those are two different things. Let's say your roommate is Palestinian or Muslim from the Arab world or Christian Arab and says, look, I really believe that there are challenges and this is a way to address those challenges. Then you should engage in a conversation. You shouldn't just assume that person is automatically anti-Semitic. And you should actually start to have the meaningful discussion in order to understand, so articulate those challenges to me, let me explain another position and hear multiple perspectives. Now, that person may ultimately say, I really just think that the problem is Jews holding on to the territory that they have in the West Bank, disputed territories, Judea and Samaria. Well, there are lots of Israelis that hold that position too. That's not anti-Semitic. But if the individual says, well, I think Israel has no right to exist, that's a different conversation. So again, remember when I said context matters? It's very easy to lump people together in these broad categories without actually having a sense of what people mean. So we have to get to what people mean. The other thing is that we can't be afraid of those conversations. The whole purpose of education is actually to engage with critical thinking skills. The purpose of the university is not for everyone to agree with one another, but for it to be a marketplace of ideas, and the good ideas will rise to the top. Now, if a university wholesale is making a very clear position in which Jews are afraid to speak out, Jews are marginalized, or Jews are afraid to identify with their Zionism, then there's a big problem. And you need the university administration to respond. You need board of trustees to know. You need alumni to know. And you need to lead a real effort in order to create better awareness and greater sensitivity. So again, it matters the context. I will say that people need to go to Israel. All different types of people need to go to Israel. So if you have a friend who's on campus who's not Jewish and they have an opportunity to travel to Israel as part of a group, a student experience, you should encourage them to do so. Because when you're in Israel, you start to engage with the complexity and the nuance of the place, and it's going to be much harder to make these broad generalizations. And of course, if you encounter any form of hatred, particularly in this case, anti-Semitism, in which there is a threat of violence, an incitement of violence, if there is a clear desire to harm, you have to report it immediately.
And back to the topic of like Congress people being blatantly anti-Semitic, how do you think we as like a very small Jewish community, how do you think that we can really fight against these like elected officials who have so much of a larger following?
So I think it's a variety of things. First of all, you're old enough still to get involved in political campaigns. You're old enough to be able to write letters. You're old enough to be as informed as possible so that when you and your friends are ready to vote, you can help people understand what the challenges are. Remember, not everyone cares about this issue. Why would they? Right? Especially if you're not Jewish, why do you care about this? Even though we know you should. So there's a whole slew of people in the middle that we refer to as don't knows. And the don't knows aren't anti-Semites. The don't knows aren't bad people, but the don't knows don't know. And they don't know that they should know. So really, we have to begin a process of helping them understand what they need to know in order to be more informed, so that when they read something, they'll pause and they'll stop and they'll ask themselves some questions, because we can't assume that they understand what you, Zach, already do know. And so your job, the more you educate yourself, is to be able to transmit that information in as an accessible, digestible way as possible. And the other thing I would say is that we have to practice difficult conversations, right? We're very used to yelling on the internet. There's a real lack of civility. There's enough anonymity that you can kind of say things and throw grenades in a way that you wouldn't if you were in person, as much as you can be in person these days. And I think we actually have to reclaim the public square. And we actually have to say, look, there's this contract between us. There's a civil contract. We care about being respectful. We care about hearing people's opinions. We don't always have to agree, but we have to do a much better job of listening so that we can actually approach with conversation and not just about confrontation.
It seems today that on a lot of like social media platforms, like on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram, anti-Semitism has become somewhat of a trend almost. And like, so first off, how do you think this happened? And second, how do you think that this can be combated?
So I think it happened in the ways that we're saying, that people want to push the envelope, that it's another platform that allows you to sort of say things that you may not say in front of a friend, but you feel okay putting it out there and seeing what the response is. I think it's acceptable because none of these sites have any government oversight, and there are no real regulations because everyone hides behind freedom of speech. And of course, freedom of speech is a real freedom that we value in this country. And also these sites are privately owned, and they don't have to be or allow those who promote hatred to do so. So there's a real problem regarding regulation that I don't think we as everyday citizens are necessarily going to resolve. I think that's a larger government regulation question. I also think, what do you do when you hear really bad speech? You need good speech. So we have to figure out, how do you report issues of anti-Semitism when you see it online, and make sure you know how to do it, because that's important. And also you have to create content that's meaningful and that is truthful and that actually gets real information out there. Because if there are those who are focused on trying to pull people over to a place in which the lies and distortions is what their primary aim is, our goal is to actually move them away from those individuals. You're not going to change the hearts and the minds of the detractors. That's not why you do it. You do it for the big group in the middle of the don't knows. And I think the way I often think about it is, we know there are certain words and certain ideas that are truly socially unacceptable. And we have to try and figure out how we create that same sense of being socially unacceptable around anti-Semitism and the way we are very sensitive for other groups. And that will take time, unfortunately, because again, this is millennia old hatred, but we have to begin now and we have to be prepared to do so.
So in this summit, we've really been talking about anti-Semitism mostly against Israel and anti-Semitism in America. How do you think we can talk about and fight anti-Semitism, not just in America, but across the world?
Well, I think, look, social has no boundaries, social media. So that's the easiest, way to be engaged in conversations that go beyond physical territorial location. I also think, living in Washington, D.C., Boston, the Bay Area, parts of New York, the East Coast is not the same as the South, and it's not the same as the Midwest. So before, we're so eager to figure out how to fight anti-Semitism in Europe, we also have to think about, there are a lot of people in this country who don't even know what Jews are. Really, they have no idea what Judaism is. They think it's the religion that came before Jesus, but they don't know what it actually is. I grew up in a small town in Tennessee. When I was young, we had prayer in the public school system. In the name of Jesus. People wanted to touch my head to see if I had horns, not because they truly hated me as a Jew, but because they had never met a Jew before. So I think we have to start in our own backyards before we look to go elsewhere. There are lots of political elements in Europe now that do exist in order to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. A lot of European countries have been adopting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. So there's a lot more awareness in some ways. But before you start thinking about how do we deal with anti-Semitism in Hungary or the UK, remember, those countries also, you need to know the context and the conversation. And you need to be able then to understand the landscape of what organizations are working at what levels of society, grassroots, education, policy, elected officials, bureaucrats, unions, and really be able to understand it before we just come in and make an imposition. That's really important. It's really important to never just parachute into a community and assuming you know what's best when you haven't been part of the discussion.
So for our final question of tonight, what do you think is the best way to include anti-Semitism in the conversation of hate?
So I think it's a really good question, and I don't think there's one way to do it, but I actually really believe in the power of humans talking about their own experiences. And I think it's very hard to dismiss someone when they're telling you about their life, when they're telling you about the hatred that they faced because of their skin color, because of the ways their eyes are shaped, because of what they believe ideologically, because of the religion or the culture that they practice. And so I think if people actually listen and build empathy and are willing to hear about one another and learn about one another. And if you don't have friends that look different than you, then start with some books and then start to figure out how you can find friends who have different experiences than you have had. I think that's the first way, and it's the most important way because we are human beings and we need to connect with one another and start to build bridges between communities. I will also just say that, once we start to actually be exposed to differences, it's a lot harder to start to throw stones at people because you realize everyone holds multiple identities. No one is just one thing, right? Ever. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a teacher, I'm an activist. right? I'm a lot of things. So we can't just pretend we're not. And when you start to bring in nuance and complexity, and you do that not only with your own individual story and other people's stories and their own narratives, but also by really listening to the complexity of history and the ideas in history, then I think it takes a lot of work, but it's the right way to ultimately begin to think about how all of these conversations deeply intersect with one another.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fish, for coming on today and just saying some things that I think everyone needed to hear and everyone needed to understand and know. So thank you to everyone who came today, and don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Together Beat Hate on Instagram, and check out for our next summit coming up in the near future on the topic of Israel. And just thank you to all who came today, all who asked questions in the chat, and especially thank you, Dr. Fish, once again for coming and just speaking to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Gen Z, and keep it up. It's important.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.